It's almost about that time, right about now.
Right about now. Funk, bunk, 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 soul brother.
I am so excited to have you on the show. I feel like it's destiny because I was this weird thing, but I was at a bachelorette party. I was the only guy at a bachelorette party over a few weekends ago, and I
think
noticed
I think that's a very honored position to
it was
be in.
extremely.
Usually-
I was very happy, and my wife approved, and it was like everything was okay, and there was no like male
Awesome.
strippers or anything. It was really fun. But one of the women was reading your book like by the pool, and I was like, oh, cool. And then, like, cut to a week later, I was at my therapist's office. This is very New York sounding. So I was talking to my therapist, and I mentioned that I was going to be interviewing you, and she's like, "Oh my God, I have that book!" Like, and she like picked it up. It was like sitting on her desk. So everybody's
That's
reading
amazing.
your book. Yeah,
Yay.
everybody's reading your book. I love it, and so I read it, and now I'm totally hooked. I think I want to get into your whole story and everything, but before we do, I just love to get a definition for you about what polyamory actually means, because I don't think a lot of people really totally understand what that word means. They hear it used a lot, but I'd love to hear your perspective. Like, what does that word mean? What are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why people don't know what we're talking about, because people mean different things when they use
Right.
these terms. And so I like to go with the old school definition, which just means like from the Greek, many loves. Actually, I think it's a mix of Greek and Latin. It's a totally made up word. But polyamory just means the ability to love more than one person. And if you read my book, you know, or if you didn't read my book, that's cool too. I'll tell you, when we started out.
I read it, by the way.
Yeah, well, thanks. I appreciate that. When we started out, my goal was to not have any falling in love happening. I wanted to not make this an emotional experience, that this was going to be about sex and adventure and none of that mushy love stuff that was going to make everything complicated. Spoiler alert, now I do,
Funny thing.
classify as polyamorous, but people, use the term non-monogamous, and sometimes people use non-monogamous and polyamorous interchangeably. But non-monogamy can cover a whole host of scenarios, everything from being like swingers or people who are really at heart maybe monogamous, but like while they're dating, they don't want to have any pressure on their relationships, and they want to be able to date several people as they kind of look for their monogamous relationship, which is also totally fine. No judgment on any of this as far as I'm concerned. But I think of polyamorous as when, and some people would argue that open marriage is not strictly polyamorous because it's too hierarchical, and that if you're truly poly, then you love everybody equally and there's no like primary partner. So everybody kind of comes at it from a slightly different place. I say I'm in an open marriage, and I say I'm polyamorous, and I say I'm non-monogamous. Like, I feel like choose your term, but they all kind of apply to me. Yeah.
And people are very obsessed with language, as we know these days. So I want to make sure I understood. And I know, like you said, there's different hierarchies of polyamory.
Yeah.
And the thing is, in all these, well, not in all these cases, but in the case of yours, it's consensual non-monogamy, right? Which is different than necessarily non-monogamy. So this is like both people have signed off on this.
Right. And sometimes people call it ethical non-monogamy, but then that's become problematic, because then there are sometimes people who are like lording it over monogamous folks as if this is the ethical position. And I'm like, I just am telling my story. I don't want to like lay.
I don't want to get into it.
I don't want to. I mean, I totally appreciate the question, and I want to have the opportunity to say what fits me and what doesn't, but I don't want to speak for anybody else. But just, yes, as it happens with everything, language is fraught. It's best to have a conversation when you're interested, as opposed to assuming you know. And I think it's also important for people not to get too uptight around the language and let it be, but that's just me.
That's a whole other conversation.
Yes, it is.
I think you're a Gen Xer like me, and I think we I think we
Indeed.
get a little confused by the Gen Z's obsession with language, and I think you have kids around the same age mine as
I
mine
do.
are too. So yeah, so
I have some Gen
um,
Zers.
yeah, the Gen Zers are interesting. Dad, you can't say that. Um,
I appreciate it though. I'm like, please tell
no,
me,
yeah,
because
tell
I
me.
would
I'm like, it's
never
okay.
have known that that's not cool to say.
I know,
They're
I know,
horrified sometimes by the things.
I know.
They're mostly horrified by what my parents say. My dad in particular,
Oh, I
who's
know.
like, you know,
Right,
greatest generation
old
or whatever he
school.
is.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
say. Yeah, I love to horrify my kids just on purpose. But all right. But you probably had no idea what polyamory was before you, spoiler alert, got involved in that life. Tell me a little bit of pre-polyamorous relationship, kind of like what was your situation in life? Where did you come from? Like, what was your background? Like a little bit
Yeah.
pre-marriage there.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the Midwest,
Hmm.
Chicago suburban girl. Um, I went to college very young. I skipped a grade, some nonsense that
Wow.
was happening mostly for girls in the 70s. They pretty much stopped doing that to kids because it's not cool. So I was like
Yeah.
9 in middle school and 12 in high school and 16 at
Whoa.
college. Yeah, it's not good. It's not good.
That's not good. It's
Um,
not good to be 16 in college. It's confusing.
no, I mean, 12 in high school was worse, to be
Yeah, that's
honest.
probably really, really tough.
It was pretty bad. By 16, I could kind of blend. By 12,
Right.
no. 12, I was not
Oh
in
my
a good
God.
place.
Yeah.
But I say that because it's also kind of speaks to where I was in life. I was very like naive, and I had very few sexual experiences before I met my husband. I had one boyfriend in college. Um, for like 4 years, and then I met my husband right away after that,
Right.
and we got married. We had, I'm making the story short, but we had one or two conversations, more than one or two, a few conversations before we got married, and a few experiences actually where we went to like sex clubs and things. My husband is 5 years older than I am. He's a New
Uh-huh.
Yorker. He's like,
Did you go to La Trapeze?
we did.
I went there. That's a whole other
Oh
story.
my God,
Oh my
that's
God, that place
hilarious.
is crazy. Does that
I
still exist?
know. I
By
don't
the way,
know. I don't know.
for our
Bowery,
listeners in the
I
Midwest,
don't
La
know.
Trapeze is a crazy sex club that was in Manhattan, I think in like the 20s or something. Like I went there with a
In the
girlfriend.
20s? What do you mean in the
Like
the
mean in
streets.
the
The
20th streets.
streets.
I feel like I
Yeah,
don't know
yeah,
why
yeah.
I remember being around that area.
Yeah,
Um, okay,
totally.
so you had some experiments
We had,
with
yeah,
there.
some experiments because my husband was like, he knew I was, if not a virgin when we got married, virginal,
Hmm.
and he had had a lot more experience than me. And also was like, there's no way, he told me this before I got married. He's like, there's no way you're going to be okay with never sleeping with someone else again. And I was like,
Right.
what do you mean? Like, of course I'm going to be okay with it. And, to his credit, he knew that about me. And one of the criticisms that people have made about with like our situation in the book, which is fair because it's like in the book you only have the information I gave, and I did have a lot of ambivalence when we did finally open up our marriage, and part of me was like, whoa. Is this happening because he planted the idea and he wants to do it? And
Right,
the answer
right.
is yes, of course. Like,
Right.
just now that we've been married for almost 25 years, we can talk about it very openly and laugh. Like, it's like anything in marriage, I think, where you're like, if you want to go to I've used this analogy before, but if you want to go to visit your parents at Thanksgiving, you'll be like, let's go see your parents at Christmas or something. You know what I
Right.
mean? You'll like suggest it in such a way that it feels like you're giving something when you're like,
Yes.
and then I'll get what I want, and it's
Right.
kind of the way it works. But that being said, it started because when my children were 3 and 6, I met somebody. It's the way the book kind of opens. I
Yep.
mean, it
Matt.
opens
We
in a
call
few
him
different
Matt.
Matt. We call
The
him
name has been
Matt.
changed. Yes.
The name has been changed to protect the not so innocent. But it was like a bolt of desire that I did not expect
Mm.
going through me, and luckily my husband and I had this conversation years earlier where I knew that he wanted me to tell him if I was feeling this way. And he would much rather have me tell him than lie about it. And I wasn't really planning to act on it per se, but I was like, yeah, I met this guy and it felt like something. And he was like, go for it. Long story short. And so that's kind of what kicked it off. I did not think that we were opening our marriage. I did not know the term ethical non-monogamy. I also didn't know, I did know, but I didn't know. It was kind of like we had never really talked about it. My parents had an open marriage, but we had never talked about it.
That's so interesting. Yeah, that part, that revelation. Yes.
Yeah, my aunt told me when I was 28, so after I was married, but before this part of my life. But so I grew up in a house that I thought was pretty prudish, puritanical, Midwestern. Turns out there was more than meets the eye, and I think that's true for a lot of people. That there is always something, you scratch the surface in a family and you're going to find something.
I've always wondered, Mom, if you're listening. But you know what's interesting? She does listen to my podcast.
All right.
But that's so interesting about your parents. Now, you said your mom called them affairs, right?
Yeah.
They didn't have the language. We're talking a lot about language.
Yeah.
But did that also mean that she was doing it secretly, or were they?
No.
Okay, so they were well aware that they were doing this.
Yeah, I mean, she said, I asked her if my dad knew about her affair, because my aunt had told, sorry, there was just a noise there. My aunt told me that your mother had an affair. You know, she's not such a goody-goody, you know, because I was complaining that she was such a goody-goody and I couldn't tell her anything. She's like, oh, she's not such a goody-goody. She had an affair. And I was like, what? And so it took me a year to then confront my mom and ask her, like, does Dad know? And she said, well, it was your father's idea.
Oh, my goodness.
So then I was like, whoa. But we didn't even but she seemed kind of ashamed of it, so I didn't talk to her about it. And I didn't really talk to her about it in any detail until I was doing the same thing.
Yeah. Now, were your parents the only people you knew that were in polyamory
Yes.
That's what's crazy. Your parents were the ones, not your friends.
No,
right.
and in fact, this is kind of like the craziest part when I was going through this, and it was hard because I was afraid I was blowing up my marriage. I felt like we were conducting this grand experiment with pretty high stakes, but I also was feeling so curious about what was happening, and it was hard and it was painful and it was also exciting, and I was learning things about myself, and you know, it was all of it. I couldn't talk to my friends. They were all like, what are you doing? The two people I could talk to about my desire for other men were my husband and my mother.
Wow.
I mean, that's unusual.
Yeah, that is kind of...
And my therapist, thank God.
And your therapist, yeah. You had a therapist, which we're going to talk about. What was your mother's take? I mean, what was the advice you asked from your mom about it? I wanted to know things like, I was so afraid, and I was particularly afraid of falling in love with somebody and what that was going to mean. If I fell in love with somebody, would that mean I would want to run away from home? You know what I mean? Because that's the way it's billed to us in society, that if you fall in love with somebody else, that must mean that you don't actually love your spouse. Interesting.
And it must mean that you're going to leave. And my mother was there to say, oh, no, sweetie, you can love someone else. It'll be great. You know what I mean? And nobody has that. And I could see it in her own life. You know, it was like her best friend that she had a relationship with, and more than him. But I feel like she's still just doling out little bits of information to me over time, because she has a finite number, and she's she's titrating it to be maximum effect.
More.
I know.
It was interesting that your fear was that you were going to fall in love, because I would think that your fear would be that your husband was going to fall in love with somebody else.
That became a fear as well. Both became fears. And really,
so you guys go ahead. So as a result, you guys sort of made when you decided you were going to embark on this experiment, as you called it, you made some rules. And what were the rules that you made?
Well, the rules were all designed to not fall in love. You know what I mean? When I look back at it now, I'm like, oh, I was just trying to minimize intimacy. And they were really mostly my rules, so that we both were supposed to follow, but then I would break them, and then whatever, we would talk about it. But things like no dating the same person twice in 1 week, no dating anybody that lives too close by.
Right, you could run into it. Though.
Yeah, I broke both of those first. And then we had things like no playing chess with anybody, because like we did that. I didn't want, and so I started playing backgammon with somebody, and I was like, ooh, this is dipping a toe into dangerous waters. It's pretty close. Yeah. But stuff like that, and it was real. No sleepovers. The idea of taking a trip with someone was like, whoa. But like, yeah, I'm going on a trip with one of my partners for his 50th birthday in a few weeks, and I'm super psyched. It's like, yeah, now that just feels normal, and I would never want that to be closed off. But at the time, it felt, we're talking now maybe 13 years ago, it felt very, very scary.
And you didn't know anybody else except for your mom that was doing this to even ask about. Right.
And my mom was very kind of careful with her information, and I didn't want to reveal too much to her either. So it was like this game I was playing, trying to get information without telling her too much about myself. And it grew over time, but that's part of the story of the book too. And I think part of what is interesting to people, like, how do you talk to your parents? How do you talk to your kids? How do you talk to your friends about anything that isn't kind of sanctioned by society, that is outside of the box?
Yeah, and it's such a taboo topic, particularly in our generation and maybe the generation like just below us. That was interesting. Do you feel like it's a little generational, like it's a little bit more accepted in the younger generations?
I think it's more accepted in the younger generation. I think it's also way more accepted in queer communities than it is among straight
like
people.
Dan Savage, Hepburn talks about it a lot.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think what really throws people in, especially people of our generation who are in hetero marriages, it really throws a lot of the gender stereotypes out the window. And this idea that women are sexual subjects, not sexual objects, that women have a libido. Like, it's crazy, but this is kind of something that, is not really seen as, not considered by people of a certain age, and also being a mother and a sexual being is very taboo in our culture still. I just did an interview with someone who's doing a story specifically about the pushback against, even in fiction, when there is a sexual mother, like in a movie, and it mostly is fiction, because real women don't want to talk about the ways that they are kind of running counter to our very strict ideas about motherhood, because they will be vilified, and people have written all sorts of things in the comments about, you can't do this to your kids. I'm like, my kids are 22 and 19, they're doing great, so don't worry. But
well, there is a moment, and I'm jumping ahead here because I do want to go back a tiny bit, but there is a moment in the book, or in the beginning of the book, when your son finds out that you guys, so he found out, I guess, by looking at one of the dating sites or something, right? He saw your husband's
he went to use my husband's laptop, which he wasn't supposed to use, but he forgot his Chromebook at school, the story, and then opened it up and found the
so you must have been waiting. Were you ever going, I mean, just like your parents kept it from you and it only came up because your aunt blew the whistle here, right? Were you ever going to tell your kids, or was it just something you feel like it's better maybe they don't ask, don't tell kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I really hadn't thought about it with a lot of clarity, and partly that's because there are just so few models, The one model I had was my parents, who didn't tell me anything, and I was kind of like, am I glad I didn't know? Yeah, I kind of am, you know what I mean? Right. But at the same time, I also felt like my mother and I never talked about sex. Like, I went to my sister when I got my period, like that kind of thing. It was that, like, I got my bras from my best friend, who was always way bigger than I was, so I would just get her hand-me-downs. Like, I didn't even want to tell my mom that I needed, like, to go bra shopping, let alone talk about sexuality. And I also knew like this is not the relationship I want with my kids, who are boys, so it's a little different, but also complicated in other ways.
Yep.
Now I really am glad that he found out the way he found out. It turns out my younger son, who's now 19, found out in a very similar way when he was 14. So they both found out as young teenagers. And I feel like it was fine the way it happened, you know.
What did you tell them? I mean, did you have it mapped out just in case this would ever happen, or were you
not as well as I should have, but I did let them know that that in both cases they were worried that my husband was cheating on me, because that's what you see. Even kids in 5 years ago would have been 2019. It's still like, oh, this is cheating. Having sex outside of marriage is cheating. Like even 5 years ago, I don't feel like non-monogamy was something that a 14-year-old had been exposed to as an idea. So the concern was they found, because my husband's kind of sloppy, like they found his dating site or whatever, and were like, oh no, Dad's cheating on you. And I'm like, no, he's not. But that also meant I had to out myself, as we tell each other about our relationships. And so I had to out myself. It's like, yeah, we're open and I do it too. And I think that was hard for, you can probably imagine as a teenage boy, nobody wants to think about their mom having sex.
Right. You don't want to have that. But it's probably more of a relief to find out they're not having, there's not infidelity in that way going on. Right.
But there was a clamor in my brain of like, am I screwing them up? Am I screwing them up? And time has told, and we've had multiple conversations now, especially with the book coming out. My older son read the book. My younger son has not. But they're very invested in their own lives now. They're not like, again, when you're 19, 22, you're not spending a heck of a lot of time wondering what your mother is up to. And that's for the best. So I feel like when women just kind of park themselves and don't feed their own humanity because they've become a mother, they just, the world doesn't benefit from that, because ultimately your kids actually don't need you. You'll just be really annoying if you need them more than they need you. And I know a lot of people have that kind of relationship with their mom, like, why don't you call? They're sitting by the phone, because they haven't developed enough of themselves to kind of have some sustenance in their life beyond being a mom.
And you found the experience of polyamory helped you find yourself more, right? You think that was one of the...
Yes, and it was just, I think it was like getting in touch with this kind of shadowy side of myself that I had never allowed to see the light of day. I mean, as I said before, I was kind of an overachiever kid, and I went to school really young, and I was always doing my work and getting A's and working hard and all of that, trying to be a good girl. And I never rebelled. I never explored my sexuality. And I feel like sex is a way, not the only way, that we kind of get to know ourselves and get to know the parts of ourselves that aren't buttoned up. And, it's a way in. So for me, it also helped me to see like that I wanted to be physical in more ways. Like I started boxing and I started playing guitar and I created a duo, and we still do open mics and stuff. And now I do.
That's awesome. You're doing music, right?
Yeah, but I do like, it's something about like I inhabited my body more fully. And I think my confidence grew out of it as well. But it was ugly for a while. It was messy. It wasn't a graceful process, and I wanted to tell the truth about that, because I was seeing a lot of stories of polyamory, like I was just born polyamorous, and
you're not the candidate that you would normally, like the cliched person that you would think.
And that's why I wanted to just broaden the lens around like, what does this look like in reality, for me anyway.
But you mentioned earlier that the experience, at first you had made all these rules to kind of prevent yourself from falling in love, but then, spoiler alert, you do fall in love, and you
Right.
find that intimacy is actually something that's very important for you in that journey that you've taken.
Yeah.
So how did you manage that without hurting your marriage?
Well, I think a couple things happened. For one, over time, like my husband and I continue to choose each other as our life partners every day. We both have other options. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah, you
Both
could.
of us have fallen in love with people who have wanted
Right.
us to get divorced. You know what I mean? That was the last relationship I wrote about in the book. There have been other relationships since. And both of us are like, no, this is a really solid relationship, and we love each other very deeply. And also just going to share, our sex is better than it's ever been, and it's like we have a great life and we love each other. So the longer that happens, where you keep choosing each other, like it doesn't even occur to me anymore that like something wild would have to happen for us to
Really?
really not want to,
Yeah.
because we at this point we can have it all. It's pretty great.
Yeah.
But it was hard for a long time getting there. And so could it have blown up? Yes. But my belief is that if our marriage couldn't weather these other relationships, then maybe it was because we couldn't grow as individuals while still in this marriage. But it turns out our growth is very supported by our marriage. But I don't think that's always the case. And I also don't think that a divorce necessarily is a failure. I think relationships are there for lots of different reasons. One of them is to help us learn about ourselves. And if we're not doing that, if we can't do that within the confines of a relationship or the construct of a relationship, then maybe the relationship needs to end, and that's okay. So,
But that's been the case with yours. Yeah.
what's
This has
that?
been it would definitely put your relationship under an extreme stress test.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And you've come out okay on the other end.
Yeah, and
Talk to me-
stronger, which like a stress
Yeah.
test kind of does,
Yeah, exactly. Talk to me about jealousy, because, it was interesting. Your husband, his reaction initially when he first of all, he told you even when you got married that, you're going to eventually want to be with other people, which he said
Yeah.
was maybe planting a seed. But then later when you told him you were attracted to Matt, he was kind of turned on by that,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
he found that like really sexy. What about you? Did you, when you permitted him to start having relationships with other women, did you find that sexy, or did you have to get over some jealousy thinking about him with another person?
Yeah, I do not find it sexy at all still. You know what I
Okay.
mean? That does
Like,
nothing
don't
for
wanna-
me. Nothing for me.
Right.
However, I will say there's a word in polyamory, compersion, which is like the opposite of jealousy. And some people define it in a very sexual sense. Like, my husband is very compersive, they would say, because he gets turned on by the idea of me with someone else. And I have met women who are like that too, that they like the idea of their husband with someone else or their primary partner with someone else. In my case, I think I have developed some compersion that's not sexual, but it just like makes me happy when he's happy. And there have been some bonuses that I hadn't anticipated. Like, for example, I've given this example before, but it's not in the book. But he loves going to Costco with one of his, with his main girlfriend, and that's freaking awesome because I hate going to Costco. And like. Yeah, like they'll go on and he'll often have a sleepover and then like hit Costco in the morning before he comes home, and I'm like, awesome.
Interesting.
Yeah, but like stuff like that. Or my one of my partners who I'm going away with next month, he's in restaurants, and we're gonna go to Nashville, and he knows
Fun.
all the cool places, and it's gonna be super fun, and this is not a trip that my husband would be up for. So he's like,
Yeah.
great, yeah, go do
for
that
it.
with Jason. That's awesome. And we get different things from different partners, and I compare it in some ways to having multiple friends, right? Like you don't just have one friend, because different friends feed you in different ways. You might have the friend
Yeah.
that you like to play ping pong with, and you have the friend that you like to go to concerts with, and you have the friend you can call when you're really upset about something. And it's similar for me in polyamory, and the idea that I would say, now it feels this way, although it did not feel this way for years. The idea that I would say to my husband, you can't have any other friends. I'm sorry, that's not going to work for me. It seems like almost to that level. Like I wouldn't be okay with being with someone who wouldn't let me have that kind of freedom. It still means that he has to be a good friend to me. You know, I'm not gonna take it if he's a bad friend to me. But he's a great friend to me, and he's a great friend to other people, and his life is fuller because of it. And I've also seen with my parents how the sexual parts of their relationships outside of marriage has waned. They're in their 80s now, but they still have these lovely friendships with people that they were intimate with. Yeah, and I think that's so beautiful, and I can see how it enriches their lives, and I would never want to take that away from my husband, and I would never want that taken away from me. But it was hard at first. Just like, you know, when I taught middle school, there would be girls in my classroom at lunch because somebody made a new friend, and it was hard. Like, if your best friend makes another friend, I was like doing a lot of work with these kids, these, 11 and 12-year-olds, and it's really a normal thing, but I wasn't saying to them, okay, this has got to stop. You cannot see that other friend. This is wrong. Like, which is what we do in our culture, as opposed to saying, oh, it's hard. I think you guys need to spend some time talking it through. And would it help if you had like a special sleepover with your friend that was just the two of you? And like, yes, and it's like, we need to cultivate, I believe, that kind of attitude. It doesn't have to be sexual experiences, but sometimes people have rules like you can't even have lunch with your ex, or you can't, like, people who don't want their spouse to have friendships of the other gender seems nuts to me, but that's me.
Right.
But that's why I believe that.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. Do you, so you have had, you at any given time you could have, obviously always have your intimate relationship with your husband, but you could have more than one polyamorous, relationship, like I don't know how to say it right.
Other partners,
other partners, right?
Yeah.
So you could have other partners. So like I have a friend, the one person I know who is in a polyamorous relationship. She's married and she has a friend, a partner, and the partner and her seem to do a lot of social things together, and her husband's more like, kind of like they do. I don't know. They don't do as many social things together. It sounds like. But anyway, she's only committed to that one person, right? Outside of her marriage. And some people do it that way. But you, in your way, you have more than one partner, and your husband has more than one partner.
Yeah, and it's not always that way. I mean, early on, I think I was dating a lot of people because I didn't know what I was looking for. And then once I realized I really want love, I've had like loving one-on-one, relationships where I have my husband and just one other person. And that has been, are we having a internet problem?
I don't know. I can hear you, so it's all good.
I think it's okay. Yeah, my memo went off.
Mine did a weird thing too.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
I've gone through those stages. Right now, I have two other partners, that one I've been with for 3 years and one for 2 years, but it just kind of leveled up recently. And it's great, but it's new. It's like, whoa, I am like actually in love with 3 people. This is wild.
That's wild.
It is. And they all know about each other, and they're all like, cool.
Are the people that are your partners also in polyamorous, or like some of them just committed only to you?
No, I mean, everybody is poly. Yeah. Not necessarily married and in an open marriage, but poly. So, which I think is really important for me anyway, just because then everybody gets it. No, like, the reason why these men are cool with me having other partners is because they have experienced that themselves and know that it's not just possible, but that's their preference too. So yeah, but it's like every kind of new stage feels like kind of a new thing. Like this is a first for me, that I have like, whoa, I have like two people, and this is such a Gen X word, boyfriend, like that I have like two boyfriends. Like,
Two boyfriends.
I know, but it's
Yes.
fun.
But that sounds so fun. It can be fun. Sorry, honey. And it sounds like it could be fun if everybody. I think the big difference between is that it's very transparent. Like everybody knows what's going on here.
Right.
Right. This doesn't really work as well if there's a lot of sneaking around.
No, I wouldn't. I mean, and I've done that. I mean, in the book, that's why I can't call myself like ethically non-monogamous, because I did plenty of unethical things. I don't.
Yeah.
I try not to anymore, but back in the day, I was not necessarily like, is this a good moral decision? I was just acting.
Yeah.
So I can't profess to be something morally superior. But I have found that it's way more fulfilling to me to be fully honest and authentic with everybody in my life, period.
Right.
A lot of people also, though, when I talk about this, they're like, how do you have the energy? And clearly, not everybody wants to have more than one. There's also a configuration that I've talked to a few people who are in where it's called monopoly. And in both cases, it's the woman who is polyamorous. These are the people I know. And the man is monogamous. He would rather not date other people, but he's okay with his partner having other
I think
partners.
that's the relationship my friend is in. She's in a monopoly.
Yeah. And that blows people's minds too, but it's like, it's kind of also like if you have somebody who's very social and somebody who's not, like you were describing, like it can be a relief for the person who's mono. Like, oh my God, I don't have to take her dancing. She can go do that. Or I don't have to go. It can happen sexually or in other ways. It allows one partner to not have to change their boundaries or to change what they fundamentally want, and allow their partner to seek what they want elsewhere in a way that I think is really loving. But it's not for everybody, and I certainly am not like pushing it on people, because I know it takes a lot of work, a lot of communication, and it's not for everybody. My goal is to normalize it, though, so it doesn't feel like there's a stigma.
Do you do your partners know each other? Do they have relationships with each other, or is it all kind of a little bit separate? Like I know in the case of my friend, they like have dinner together and they do like holidays together.
Yeah.
Right? He doesn't have kids, so that becomes a little less complicated, I think, because if you have kids, mixing that up is just how do you explain?
Right.
This? Like, why do we always have this special guy over at our house for? Yeah.
Right. One of my partners has kids and one of them does not. My husband's partners are different. My husband has met both of my partners, and I have met my husband's main girlfriend, and but we don't all hang out. And it like I can envision it happening if it happened naturally, if like, you know what I mean? At like my book launch or something, one of my partners was out of the country. The other one, like if they had both been in the country, they would have met each other, but they weren't. So
when
you
met your husband's partner, did it get you? Do you still get a little bit jealous, or
it was good. She was really lovely. It was like, I'm human. She's younger than I am, but it's funny too. I've said this before. It's like, I kind of like that she's younger though, because she's not Gen X, and so she kind of kicks his ass a little bit more than, you know what I mean? Like, she's like, what is this bullshit that you're doing? You know, he's 56 and she's 42, I think. And I'm 51. So it's like, I like it. I used to get more upset about a younger woman, but now I'm like, please, welcome.
Bring him on.
Like let's get another voice.
As long as he's, and it matters to you that he's still attracted to you, right?
Yeah.
Like, I can imagine.
Yeah. But I'm confident enough in that now.
Yeah, now you're you don't
but it's also like, it's hard. I mean, aging as a woman is, that's new too. Being 51 is new, but so far so good. I'm okay. My mother I wrote about it in the book, and she showed me another email recently from the guy that I call Buddha in the book. That was her nickname for him. But he sent her an email that I talked about in the book where he's just said, Mary, you were in my dream the other night and you were beautiful. And, my mother now is 81. She's in a wheelchair with Parkinson's. And to have this person in her life that still thinks of her in this like beautiful romantic way, like it feeds her soul, And then just a few weeks ago, he sent some pictures he had found of the two of them. And she showed me. And she was like 40 in the picture and just glowing and gorgeous. And it was just really sweet, that she has those connections and those memories, and that my dad is like, yeah, it's sweet.
Yeah.
I think it's sweet.
Now, this is your first book, right?
Yes.
And you were a teacher. Is that your profession?
Yeah, that's what I studied in school. I got my master's in education and majored in English for undergrad.
Had you been published before this book?
No, and I thought this is what we were going to be mostly
You're a really
talking
good writer.
about. Oh, well,
yeah.
thank
By
you.
the way, well, I want to get into this part. This is the second part of the interview.
Okay,
we're
cool,
talk about.
cool.
Yeah, because how did you it's a really well written book. It's
Thank you.
funny, but it's also really, you take really deep dives and are not afraid to talk about things. And so I'm curious how the book came about at all.
Yeah.
When you decided to write it, how you got it published, etc.
Yeah, no, it's a good story. It's kind of a series of stories because it happened in
Cool.
stages, right? So, honestly, I got the idea during a meditation. I started meditating at the end of 2018. So shout out for transcendental meditation. Like the Beatles did it. They say it improves your creativity, and it has been my experience definitely that it's
That's
kind of
awesome.
opened
I had a
up.
woman on my podcast that was unfortunately her parents were in it, and she had to go to the cult out in Iowa. The
Maharishi Institute. Well,
if you get too deep, yeah.
Well, from my book, my mother was in this practice called Mahakari. And when I found out that Maharishi was the name of the guy who brought TM to America, I was like, fuck, why does it have to sound so similar? Sorry for swearing. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this.
That's okay. No, you're totally
okay. So I was like, Maharishi, Mahakari. Okay, let me get past it. I don't feel like it's cultish. And I think it's also hard when you're a kid, when you're brought into your parents' journey.
Of course.
Which is something.
This is my experience. I was brought into my parents' spiritual group when I was a kid. So yes, you're preaching to the choir. Yes.
Children of the 70s, right? It's there is some stuff going on. Yeah. So I found this as an adult. And so I was meditating. I got the idea for the book. It felt impossible though, because I was like, my youngest still didn't know about the open marriage. My parents weren't out, even to my sister, about the fact that they had had an open marriage. And I was like, I don't know how to write a book. I'm an English teacher, but I loved writing, but I am also, as a student of literature, I know that I knew I wasn't that good at it. You know what I mean? However, just like when I started guitar, I thought I couldn't sing. Turns out I can. And just like anything, when you open up your creative channels and when you work at something, you can get better and you can ask for help. So first of all, my son found out about the open marriage the next week. So I was like, okay, this is a sign from the universe. And then I talked to my parents and they were cool with it, a little nervous, but cool. Yeah. So then I just started writing. And were
they nervous about them being at it or about what would happen to you?
Both.
Okay.
Both. They, my mom was like, maybe you could use a pen name, or maybe you could write it as a novel. And I felt really strongly about owning our story. And I was like, so I ended up using the only real names in the book are really my parents' names and me and my husband. Everybody else, I was like, okay, you don't have to own it, but we have to own it as our experience so that it has that kind of gravitas that I wanted it to have. This is not made up. This is real, So then I just started working on writing, and I took some classes. I took workshops with Sackett Street Writers, which is in Brooklyn. I took a memoir workshop, and because I'm a really good student, I am really into homework. And so I studied, like the teacher said, you should read, The Art of Memoir by Mary Carr. You should read, Save the Cat or whatever about plot
Yeah.
structure. You know what I mean? I read like a
read it all.
gazillion craft books, and I just started reading memoir voraciously, which hadn't been of that much interest to me prior, but like I started really pouring into memoir. And what I did as an English teacher is I would try to unpack what makes books good. You know what I mean? Like, why is
Yeah.
this so good? And so I've always loved doing that. So I started kind of studying memoir for like, what makes this amazing? So I started like I read Sally Rooney, which is fiction, not memoir, but I felt like what I love about her work is that she talks of, you know how a character feels without her ever saying how they feel. And I was like, how does she do that? So I started like dissecting. I was like, it's like what you notice, what you're looking at. You know what I mean? It seems so obvious,
Yeah.
but I really geeked out on that.
No, but I think that's so important. I think it's a great advice for writers that if you really want to get immerse yourself. I was just watching a documentary about the making of Thriller.
Oh.
Now, people might not love Michael Jackson, but one of the interesting things that they talked about was that him and Quincy Jones, before they made Thriller, sat down and listened to they just sat down for hours and listened to every single song that was popular at that time.
Wow.
And kind of dissected. Why is this song like? What do we like about this
Yeah,
song? What is
that's
it?
cool.
They really plugged into what was happening, and it's the same with books. I mean, there's a woman that was on my podcast, Kristen Hanna, who has like the number one.
Oh,
book out
yeah.
now, right? She did the same thing when she was lying sick in bed. She went and read all the books that she liked, like Prince of Tides, all these books that she loved, as a teenager, as
Right.
a young adult, and just like tried to study what makes this book work, right?
Right.
So what were some of the you mentioned Sally Rooney. I know she doesn't write memoirs, but what were some of the memoirs you read that really like talked to you, spoke to you?
Yeah, well, like some of them yielded experiments that didn't work. One of the first memoirs I read was Calypso, which isn't exactly a memoir, but it's David Sedaris. It's like kind of a memoir in essays. And so that was my first idea. I'm going to write this in essays. And that was my first draft. I am no David Sedaris, and so it was tragically bad. But I didn't know that. I thought it was brilliant, and so I sent it to 50 agents and got rejected by everybody who answered. Everybody else just said, no, thank you, or just didn't respond. And so then, and I'll get back to your question, then I realized, okay, this manuscript might suck. I thought maybe it was great, but turns out, there was one quote I read, I can't remember who said it, but like, unrecognized genius is not a thing. Which I really I was like, okay, like everybody is in agreement but me, like this is not a work of genius. And so I was like, damn. So I was like, maybe I need to write this as a book proposal, because for memoir you can do that. It doesn't, for fiction it has to be a manuscript.
Yeah, the full manuscript.
For agents pitching memoir, they might ask for the manuscript or they might ask for a proposal. So I was like, okay, let me just like bag this. But I was like, I didn't know how to write a proposal. So I signed up for an online course. We're in the pandemic now, so everything's online. And I did an online course with this guy in Toronto who's an agent on how to write a book proposal, and he ended up becoming my agent because he really liked my idea. And so that's how I got an agent. I just got rejected and then needed help. But he told me then that I had not written a story. I had written basically something that was not and that's when I realized I had tried to do what David Sedaris was doing and written a book of essays, except my essays did not work as a story the way his do. So it was just all over the place. There was no arc. He suggested that I read Story by Robert McKee, which is a craft book, not a memoir, but it's about screenplays. And it was really interesting because I started thinking about the acts of my story. I read, also during that time, I started listening to Danny Shapiro's podcast.
She's been on.
Oh, cool.
She's been on my podcast.
Oh,
cool. She has a great backstory about how she became,
I've been to, I followed her around. I went to a workshop with her in Kripalu recently, but I was on her podcast too, on Family Secrets,
awesome.
Because I felt like
you're perfect.
Because my mother had this secret. She kind of, the way we did it, it's coming out in June, that episode, but for her it was more about the secrets I was keeping from myself. So the interview with her was fascinating. I felt like it was a really
Sure.
great extended therapy session.
Yeah.
But I read her book, not just Inheritance, but also
Yeah.
Hourglass, which is about her marriage. And for me, reading her and how she can write different memoirs.
She's written a lot of memoirs.
Yeah, that was fascinating
Yeah.
to me too. It made
Yeah.
me realize, oh, I've got way too much here. I need to narrow my focus. And so that was one of my big takeaways from her. And also the way that she builds meaning out of things that might otherwise seem mundane. I found really beautiful another writer, Courtney Malm, who I've been following her Substack. And she wrote Before and After the Book Deal. I don't know if you know her work, but anyway,
No.
she's talked about, Dana Shapiro is also the art, as perfecting the art of the zoom out. How in memoir, you're telling your story, but then there are times you have to like zoom out into something larger than you. And I don't know how often I did it or how well I did it, but I think I need to do it more in my next memoir. I think I'm working on my second one now.
Oh, good.
But Dana Shapiro, I was like studying her stuff and also listening to her podcast and then reading a lot of the books that were mentioned in her podcast. Like I read Empty by Susan Burton and stories, especially by women who were incorporating something from their childhood and their own mothers, because I think that's a real typical through line for women, like the ways in which we are trying to not be our mothers and then accidentally become them in some ways.
Yeah.
And so that was
Why is that?
yeah, I became an 8th grade English teacher too, and that was what my mom was. So
Oh, that was your mom, was?
yeah, it was weird because I was really not planning to do that. But anyway, those are just some of the books I was reading.
Yeah, those are. And so once the book, obviously the agent did they sell it right away? Did it have a lot of notes? It was one of those books that sold like on the pitch, or did you have to kind of go through a lot of revisions before you got it ready?
Well, I started over with my agent. When he signed me, when I had that first session with him to talk about like writing a book proposal, I sent him the first 3 chapters and he was like, I love it. I love the story. It's like a story that hasn't been told. I think, you can write. He's like, but you have to start over. It's not a story. So I was like, okay. So I started over. He told me I had to start over. Even after he signed me, I thought I was like, ooh, now he likes what I'm doing. He's like, no, you got to start over again. So I started over that during the course of that year, maybe 5 times. I mean, I pretty much threw out my whole first draft that I had pitched initially. But I think this is good for aspiring writers to hear because I started over many times. I trashed another 100+ pages over the course of that year as I was starting. And for me, the aha moment came when I changed my writing to present tense. One of my agent's critiques, and not every agent will do this for you. I found somebody who he liked working with people who hadn't been published before.
Yeah.
According to him, it's because you haven't made all the mistakes. Because he's like, if you had submitted this to publishers with a different agent, my first draft, and you would have gotten 50 no's from them, and then we can't go back. You know what I mean? So it's like he really worked with me to craft something. And I am a diligent student. So if he gave me notes, I sometimes had to lie down and cry for a while. And then I would get up and I'd be like,
And do it.
And I rejected some of his notes. And he was like, good, that means you know what you want. Like, you don't have to say yes to everything, but you have to have a reason or another option or, why this won't work. And you have to have a clearer vision of what it is you're doing here. So one of his critiques is that I kept reassuring the reader that I was okay now. He was like, you have to let them experience this with you. You can't, I had basically opened the book by like, back when I was 35, I was a mess. Yeah. I'm fine now. It was like not quite that bad, but like, so I was like, let me just try writing it in present tense. And I thought it was going to be an experiment and that I was going to like try to get into kind of like the more visceral feelings, and then go back and change it back to past tense, but I really liked it in present tense. And apparently that's unusual, and some people have said, oh, I didn't even realize it was in present tense when I read it.
I didn't really realize it, but now that I'm thinking about it, but that really makes sense. And it reminds me of an experience I had. I did this, it was fictional, this thing for Redbook a long time ago. It was called Diary of He.
Oh.
And it was basically like a diary of a bad boy like living in New York, and this was like the blog days where like they would post it as a blog. But anyway, part of the because it's a diary, it had to be written in the past tense because you're reflecting. Well, I guess anyway, because
It's like
it was
immediate past.
precision-
It's like today
yeah, it's immediate past today. But it's like I always knew it was hard to write in that way sometimes because I knew how it was going to end up, but I had to kind of keep I had to keep the suspense as if I didn't know,
Right.
like what was going to end up happening. But if you're writing in the present tense and you don't like it's all happening in real time,
right. And what I think the benefit was for me with this story in particular is if I, to just tell people, oh yeah, I opened my marriage 15 years ago. And now I don't feel jealous anymore. Nobody's going to believe that. I had to, and I did.
You had to experience it with you.
And I had to re-experience it as I was writing it. There were whole chunks that I was glossing over because I didn't want to delve into the shame that I felt around some of the things that I had done. And I wasn't being fully honest with how painful certain things were. I was worried that I was going to show my husband in a not so glowing light if I talked about how angry I had been at him. But I had to like kind of live it again. I listened to a lot of the music I was listening to at that time.
Yeah.
I was just like, and I would have to cry. I'm a big crier. That's been one of the critiques of my book too. She keeps crying. I'm like, well,
stop crying.
I cry
It's
a lot.
okay. That's what you
I
do.
cry. That's
well,
what I
part
do.
of what's great about your book is that it's real and it's you. And
Yeah.
that's
I mean, I cried a lot more than I actually put in the book, so they should be grateful. But I would like while I was writing, I would have to like take cry breaks because I was feeling it, and I was like, I knew I was onto something when I was feeling it enough that in the middle of writing a scene, I would have to go like have some feelings and then come back to the page.
There must have been a lot of times because this is very unprecedented what you did for you professionally, but also just like there's not a lot of. I mean, there's ethical slut. Like there's certain books, but like. I don't know. And again, I'm not really I don't know the whole canon of polyamory, but it seems like your story is the reason it's resonated so much is because you're like a real person with kids, right?
Yeah.
Like you're a little bit older maybe than like the typical person that practices polyamory. So it's like, it felt very fresh, but at the same time, there was no precedent whether this was going to make it or not. So what kept you going? Do you think if you hadn't had that agent, you would have kept going on this, or would you have just kind of given up? Well,
this is where it gets kind of woo-woo also because, I told you already that the idea came to me sort of fully formed, obviously not fully formed because I had no idea what I was doing, but I was like, oh, I have to write this memoir.
In the meditation.
And I kind of came out of it. It almost felt like a premonition. And so every time there was an obstacle, I did have a momentary I don't think this is going to work. But like, I will say my oldest son, who is a musician, and without outing...
Mine too.
I won't. I'm not going to out him because he's trying to, his career is different.
That's okay.
But anyway, he's a successful musician, and his first album came out in 2020 when he was only 18, which is pretty freaking good. He got signed it came out in 2021, but he got signed as an 18-year-old.
That's exciting.
And
it's good for me to hear because my son's about to go to music school and he's a big musician. He's about to go to college.
Oh, exciting.
I'd like to hear about success.
Yeah. And my son did not go to college because he got signed instead, and it was COVID and all that stuff. But
that makes sense.
I was discouraged. He knew, that I was working on this book. Both my kids knew about the book, but I kept saying, don't worry, it probably won't get published because I didn't want them to freak out. And they were like, okay, whatever. But my oldest knew that I was frustrated when I got rejected from a bunch of agents, and I was like, some of them are saying I don't have a social media presence, and I don't know this, and he was like, I don't have a platform, and to write a memoir you have to have a platform. And my son said to me, he's like, I didn't have a platform, or his band didn't have a platform when we got signed. He was like, I think you have two choices, Mom. You can either work on creating a platform, or you can create something really good. And I was like, oh, deep. And I was like,
that's a good.
Yeah. And I was like, you know what? I want to create something really good. And that's when I started investigating the book proposal route. And I was like, I need more help. Clearly, I thought this was good, and it's not. But I know I have something here, and I feel this story needs to be told, because like things were just starting to come into the media with polyamory, and I was like, nothing was reflecting my story. So it was like kind of in the fringes of the zeitgeist, but not in the mainstream. And so I knew there was like a potential audience, but not, but I knew I needed help. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to work on making something really good. And so I just kept working.
Yeah. And you needed help, and you got help. And the mentor really, in your story, sounds like, well, it's your life and probably people around you, but it sounds like this agent was very helpful.
He was.
Just keeping you accountable.
And then your other question, when we put it out on submission, the first round of submissions, we submitted it probably to 50 editors. The other thing I love about my agent is he's very transparent about like who we're sending it to and what, there was like a Google sheet that I could watch and torment myself with as the no's came in. And we got a lot of.
I went through this a few years ago. Unfortunately, my book did not get sold. Anyway.
Well, there can be another round of submissions.
It was nice to read and there was nice to see the comments, and they were all very positive. So
that's great.
It was never a yes.
My agent was sending me some of the very negative comments because he thought it was great news. There was one woman who was an editor, I can't remember where, who rejected it and wrote like a 3-paragraph rejection filled with like a visceral negative reaction. She was like, this book was it's disturbing. And my agent, Sam, was like, he sent it to me. He's like, isn't this great? And I was like, why are you sending me this? He was like, no, even the no's are like really passionate. He's like, that's great. He's like, you're making people feel something. And I was like, okay, I guess that's good. And then,
you cry.
Right, I was. Every time I talked to him, practically, I cried. He was getting used to me. He was like, okay, go cry. I'll call you back. But then we got 2.
I almost feel bad I haven't made you cry.
No, I'm better now. I am better.
Okay, good.
I mean, I still cry, but less on screen.
But I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, that's fine. But there were 2. We got 2 offers, and one was Sourcebook, which is a smaller press out of Chicago, which I would have been delighted with, but the other was Doubleday, and when Doubleday comes a calling, it's hard to say no. And I fell in love with the editor, who is the head of nonfiction, and I was reading some of the other books that she had done. She did Hidden Valley Road, the Robert Kolker about, she does reported nonfiction usually, and has worked with all these Pulitzer Prize winning journalists. So I was kind of like, what is up? But I think what it takes is an editor she was fascinated. She was like, this is an interest, and she was personally fascinated, and she lives in Brooklyn, and she's got a kid.
Relate
to
it.
She was like, I really connected to this story, and we connected as people. And so I feel so grateful that I landed with Doubleday, but like, just for everybody out there who's, I literally had so many rejections for agents and so many rejections from publishers, but it just does take the one yes, and the person who sees the potential in it and is as excited about it as you are and wants to make it as great as possible.
And know that the other thing I take away from your story is that, you might not have had this. I love what your son said, because you might not have had the social media platform. Like I don't have, I have this podcast, which is great, but I don't have like 600,000 Instagram followers, whatever.
Right.
But I have my story, and you have you can only tell your story, like especially if you're writing a memoir, right? You have your story, and nobody else has your story. Right.
And I felt that way too. I was like, I felt like it was an important story, and I was like, if I don't write this, who's going to write this? It's not like I'll let someone else write this. No, this is either I write this or nobody's going to write this memoir about being a mom in an open marriage.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know any of you. I'm sure they exist.
Well, they're coming.
Probably in my social circle. Yeah. They're coming out of the woodwork.
Well, I'm getting DMs on my Instagram from women all over the country who are like, I can't tell anyone. And even like a woman in Austin who works for like a very sex positive publication was like, I don't feel comfortable coming out as open because I have a kid. It's just fascinating.
It's the kid thing.
It's the kid thing. It's like they don't want the other moms to know.
Right.
because
And then maybe the kids, it's embarrassing for the kids to
yeah,
have to
or they
explain
get
it to you.
judged. And so I do feel like, again, I feel like kind of this responsibility, and this is partly how I build it to my parents to get them more comfortable with it. I was like, we all feel really good about our marriages, you know, and I'm like, we're in this position, like, I don't have to worry about my parents disowning me. My kids are old enough. They're out and doing their own thing. Again, if I don't write this, who is? It's like, I am in the safest position possible to do this. And
Did
so
you?
I wanted to. Yeah.
Yeah. And now I know you have to go in a
No,
minute,
it's
but
fine.
just a question about your reaction, the reaction of the book, because it's interesting that a book like this, like you said, it's going to cause a passionate reaction
Yeah.
on either side. And you've kind of gotten it from the far right, but you've also gotten it from the far
I
left.
have, yeah.
You know, talk a little bit about that. And then how do you deal with like any of the negativity? Because like you said, you're a sensitive person. Like it must be hard to read mean reviews and
Yeah.
being
I'm
critical.
getting better about it. I'm realizing it's not really about me. It's about
Yeah.
the things about me that people know,
Yeah.
and that's fair. Like that's what happens when you put yourself out there. So, yeah, I was expecting the reaction from the right of being like, you can't do that to the children, or like marriage is sacred and da da da. I was not expecting to, there was an article in the New Yorker, for example, about basically polyamory being a playground for the rich. And the examples used were me, Shiv from Succession, and Daphne and Cameron from White Lotus. And I was kind of like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, first of all,
That's not fair.
they're
Right.
fictional.
Yeah.
And I am not nearly that wealthy. You know what I mean? So I was like, I was a teacher. Like, yeah, I live in a brownstone,
Yeah.
but I'm not like Shiv from Succession. But anyway, it's opening up a conversation, and what I have had the opportunity to talk about that. My feeling is, there are a lot of polyamorous people who are not wealthy, and in fact, polyamory can be a great way to make it as a family if you have people who I know who I've met through this writing life, who live in like a polycule. There was just a write-up about the 20-person polycule in the New York Times. It doesn't have to be that level,
Right.
but even 3 adults sharing a home and raising children together, that's one more income, one more set of hands. And I think there are a lot of people, whether they're poly or not, who are kind of looking into these new ways to cohabitate. That book, Other Significant Others, that came out, has kind of exposed this idea that the nuclear family is not functioning for most people. And so we need to open this up so that it's not stigmatized, that like you don't just have to isolate yourself with one other person and try to figure out how to do it, because it's hard. So I think it's opening the conversation anyway. And the truth is, like, if I can't write about it as a white heterosexual Brooklynite, who the heck can? So I don't know who
Right.
people are expecting to be the voice of polyamory if it's so stigmatized still. And I am happy to be a voice, but I've never tried to be the voice. I welcome.
I think you'd rather not be
I would
the
rather
voice,
not,
yeah.
and I always take this opportunity. If you have not found, if you are interested in polyamory, I highly recommend Entwined by Alex Alberto, who is a self-published, non-binary author who wrote a beautiful book about their experience with polyamory. And you got to
It's not
support
for
each other.
everybody, right?
It's not for everybody, but it's also not just for people who are like of a certain income level.
Or a certain, like you said, less heterosexual people at least admit to doing it.
Yeah, it's more accepted,
it seems
I
like-
think. Yeah.
It's more accepted in the gay communities, queer communities, which we can get into why that is. This is so interesting. Oh my God, you just like answered so many of my burning
Oh,
questions.
great.
So thank you so much for sharing this. I mean, I like to end on like a positive, and you told so many encouraging things, but what did you learn the most about writing in this experience that you didn't really know going in, that now that you could tell yourself coming out of it on the other end?
I think I learned a couple things. One, you write in order to understand. You don't have to understand before you start writing, that you can write your way into understanding, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, because I think you still need to understand something about the human experience in order to write your way into a character. And the other thing, and this was, I read early on Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. And
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this
That's a great
idea, and it's come up in other kind of craft books or workshops I've done too, but like this idea that your work is bigger than yourself, that there is kind of a collective consciousness that you are part of and you're tapping into, and this is a very TM kind of idea too, but like meditation in general, Jungian, the idea that you're tapping into something bigger than yourself, and you don't have to be guarded with it. You don't have to be like, oh, I don't want to tell anybody my idea, or I don't want to show anybody my work, or I don't want to hear people's reactions to it. It's like, I feel like to open yourself up to like kind of a larger communal energy. I know it sounds woo-woo. But I think that's...
You're not going to ever sound too woo with me. I grew up in a...
That's right. But it's very...
I
do feel strongly like for this next book that I'm working on, I'm like kind of journaling with myself before I sit down to write. Like trying to get kind of in touch with not my little petty small ego, but something kind of like the bigger self that's got the bigger picture in mind. Which is, I think meditation can do that. I think journaling can do that. I think any way you can kind of quiet the ego in order to allow for something bigger to guide you as you're working. You
meditate,
cool.
Obviously, to clear your mind. Do you do like a morning page type, or do you journal?
This journaling business is brand new, and I'm just trying it. And often I'll just write one sentence, and then I'll be like,
right.
Okay, I'm here. Like I just kind of write to make sure that the me that needs to be here is here.
Right.
Not like the anxious crying me, even though
check the crying me at the door.
Yeah, I mean sometimes she shows up, and that's cool. I try to be gentle with her. Yeah, she's okay. She tries. She tries so hard.
She's trying so hard.
I know.
Well, I'm glad she's trying. Thank you so much for sharing this book with the world. I think it's wonderful. And I'm excited that you're going to be writing some more memoirs.
Thank you.
Are they going to be on a similar topic, or you don't have to tell me?
No, I'll tell you. It's I have the title for the next book. I haven't sold it yet either.
Oh,
but
wow.
It's Memoir, and your memoir in polyamory is your partner's partner. So I have the other part of the story. My first draft that I said was terrible. Part of what made it terrible too was that I was trying to write about it as I was living it, and so I kept like adding chapters to my outline or whatever. And then this happened, and I'm like, wait a minute, no. So I had to like cut off one story at a natural endpoint, which is February 2018, which is more.
Yeah.
And then Metamor. See how that works there with the titles? More Metamor. Tells this.
I thought it was going to be even more.
Even more. No, Metamor. From 2018 to 2020. And it's, I'm still working my way into how to tell this story. I know what happened, but there's so many ways to tell it. And so I'm still kind of figuring out how to tell it. But it relates to my partners. So one of my husband's girlfriends and the man I was dating at the time, his other partner.
And let me ask you a question about that, because sometimes I think this is something that I kind of go through when I'm thinking about writing my own memoir, is that it's when you're writing about other people.
Yeah.
Do you feel like, and again, you went through this with your parents, do you feel like you need to talk to them, even though you might change their names, and do you need to talk to them?
The only person I got permission to really write it, I didn't even ask my parents for permission. It was like a courtesy.
Just did it.
Guess what? I'm going to write about you. My husband, that mattered to me, and he gave me blanket permission.
But otherwise,
I didn't.
Do you change enough details?
I did. I changed a lot of details, and Danny Shapiro said it well in the workshop that I went of
hers.
What did she say? She was quoting somebody else who I can't remember, but it was like a man who was writing about his brother who had like extreme mental illness, and he's writing about like their childhood and how his brother was always like in his room with the door shut. And it wasn't like the whole of his book, but it was part of his book. And the way he said it is like, what happened on my brother's side of the door is his story, and what happened on my side of the door is my story.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
And so I'm writing from my perspective.
Right. I'm not writing what I think he's thinking. I'm writing my experience
Right.
of him.
Right. And I tried to do that with my parents too.
fair.
So at one point I was thinking I might kind of try to embody my mother's story and tell her story. And I was interviewing her, and then I was like, this isn't working. I need to just talk about the conversations we've had and the way I talk about you in therapy. You know what I mean? Because like, and you're my mom, you're fair game. You know,
we
that's
go.
it. But yeah, and people might be upset, but nobody's gotten upset with me from this book. Isn't that amazing?
great.
Nobody's been.
Matt hasn't called up, or
Well, I'll be honest with you. Matt and I have retained a friendship, and so we have
good.
talked, and he's cool with it.
he's cool
So
with
we
it.
got back in touch.
Well, Matt was your inciting incident.
He was.
He
He was.
He was your inciting. He was what got you into Act 2.
He was.
All right. This is so interesting. I'm gonna. Molly Roden Winter, thank you so much for joining us. The book is called More, a Memoir of Open Marriage. It's a big bestseller. I highly recommend that you read it. We only scratched the surface here. So thank you for talking to me.